Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about ESSA guidelines and What Works Clearinghouse. I got a lot of questions about this recently after I did a review of the Read 180 program. I had given a particularly negative review of the program based off its research results, whereas What Works Clearinghouse had given a particularly positive review based off ESSA standards. And I wanted to go over the difference in our framework and why that happened. So ESSA is the Every Student Succeeds Act. It was passed by President Obama. And within that act, educational programs had to meet specific guidelines to be deemed evidence-based, which I actually think is a really good thing. What Works Clearinghouse is a government body which reviews education research and provides advice as to what is best practice, as well as reviews programs and their studies to deem whether or not they're evidence-based. They do so based off of the ESSA quality system, which, if memory serves me correct, was originally put out by Dr. Slavin. So under this system, studies that are rated as strong have to have at least one well-randomized, well-conducted study showing significant positive outcomes and no highly rated studies showing negative outcomes. Moderate studies or moderate evidence is they need to have at least one quasi-experimental study showing significant positive outcomes, and promising is just correlational research that isn't, or less high quality research. It's very hard to get these tier 1 and 2 because there's also additional qualifications that need to be met in order to be deemed as having high enough rigor or research standards. Studies must be of programs available to the United States. Studies must have been carried out from the 1990s to present. They must have at least 350 students. I think that's the really hard one. And they must have at least 2 educational sites. Very few studies will have 350 students plus on them. In fact, most studies won't even have a control group. And I think it's fair to exclude any study that doesn't have a control group, but excluding studies that don't have these 350 students is really difficult because the vast majority of studies won't have that. Similarly, studies also must show baseline equivalence. This is a good practice in principle. Studies must use qualifying standardized tests. This is, again, a good practice in principle. It means that we're not using custom-made assessments that can inflate results. Although I think it's better personally to just control for this factor by showing the results for studies that use standardized tests versus studies that did not. That's what I do. Study durations have to be at least 12 weeks, perfectly reasonable. Studies have to have at least 2 teachers and 30 students per treatment. Studies must have less than 25% attrition. The 25% attrition rule seems really logical on its face, but oftentimes longitudinal studies have really high attrition rates because they're years long. And this can come into play specifically for certain programs. Sometimes a program can have negative long-term consequences. For example, there's an infamous balanced literacy program that has shown really poor long-term longitudinal outcomes. And removing these types of studies can inflate your results. In my opinion, there are 4 main problems with this model. 1, it assumes any positive effects is proof of efficacy. So they don't necessarily worry about how positive results are or what is the impact of a study. They just look to see if the results were significant and positive. So, for example, a study could show a really, really minimal but statistically significant improvement, and they would see this as possibly strong evidence as long as the other criteria were met that I described earlier. This is problematic, in my opinion. In fact, I would say it's the most problematic part of their system because most studies show positive outcomes. Another problem with this is that studies that meet all of this criteria can be very expensive to fund and sometimes can cost up to $1 million. So now we're in a position where only the wealthiest companies can afford to have these studies done, and they don't have a high bar, I should say, to pass in order to prove that the results are significant. This is sort of a bad combination, in my opinion, because it really just gives a leg up to really big corporations and companies, because sort of regardless of the results, as long as they can have a study of a certain quality of a certain cost, they can get this tier 1 evidence, which is not ideal in my opinion. It also excludes the majority of research. I would say vast majority of studies don't even have a control group, as I mentioned earlier, let alone um, meet all of these standards. And I get the idea and principle of saying, well, hey, there's a problem with quality in education research, which there is. So let's only look at the top studies. The problem is that when you exclude this much, you really limit the picture. For example, reading recovery is one of the most well-studied programs. And I would actually argue that the results are not particularly positive in some regrets and in some forms. Um, but they submitted 79 studies to What Works Clearinghouse, and they had 3 reviewed. Now they were the 3 highest quality, but 3 is not enough, in my opinion, personally, to say much of anything, because you don't have enough replication. I was once interviewed Dr. Steve Graham on this subject, and he said he felt you needed at least 6 studies to properly replicate something. And I've seen, looked at a lot of language program studies, and I've seen studies where we have like replication, same design, same program, same grade, and we have completely different results study to study. In fact, that's not that uncommon. Sometimes you even see some results where one study shows super positive effects and one study shows negative effects. Jolly Phonics, which I think actually has some of the most positive results, although their studies tend to be lower quality. They have one study that shows really, really high results and one study that shows statistically significant negative results. So if you only looked at, say, the top one of those studies, you might get a very different picture than if you looked at both or all of them. Another problem with this is that it's not accessible for educators. So the What Works Clearinghouse write-ups and reviews, they're very dense, they're very complicated, and I understand why. They're trying to really focus in on the quality of the studies, which is difficult to do because it's a complex thing, and there's a lot of factors that play into quality. But it also, the way it's written up, it just means that the average person who reads it won't really truly understand what the material is saying. I think part of why they don't necessarily look as much into the quantity of studies or the replication of studies is because the theory is that if the studies are high quality enough, that we won't need replication. But as I said before, this isn't really accurate. So I want to give you an example and show how this actually looks in practice and why I think it's bad in practice. And I'm going to look at effect sizes. And just as a review, I want to remind the audience what effect sizes are and how we interpret them. Effect sizes are essentially standardized percentages. They're a tool to standardize results between multiple studies. Meta-analyses use them, and so does What Works Clearinghouse. And they are interpreted in the following way. So anything below 0.2 is seen as negligible. And I really want to highlight that today because a lot of the studies we're going to look at are going to be below 0.2. By negligible, I mean the results are so small that we can't be sure that the impact was meaningful, or rather than just random statistical noise, which happens in studies. Average evidence is considered 0.5 in education, or sorry, in general, by the person who invented this theory. Although I will say, particularly for reading studies, we tend to see lower. So when I look at effect sizes in reading research, I'm typically looking to see if they pass this 0.4 barrier, because most studies don't. So if I see a study passing that 0.4 barrier, I'm generally speaking fairly impressed. So none of the studies we're going to look at today are going to have this 0.8 or 0.1, 0.2 range. So we're just going to move on. So I'm going to look at Read 180. This program has over 20 studies, with almost all studies showing below that 0.2 threshold that I showed you. It shows a mean across all of these studies of 0.08, which is nowhere near significant in my opinion. And they have the 12 highest quality studies. If we look at just those highest quality ones, showed on average no meaningful benefit, meaning again, they showed below that 0.2 threshold. These were the results in aggregate for different variables across the study. So we have 0.21 for comprehension is the only statistically significant one using the effect size guide as laid out by Dr. Cohn. And we also have 3 negative outcomes. Whereas when we look at the What Works Clearinghouse report, this is the summary they have on the top of showing why they say it's strong evidence of efficacy. And they found positive effects on comprehension and positive effects on reading in general, which I'm assuming actually they're referring to comprehension again, because that was the only statistically significant effects I found, at least in aggregate, and reading fluency. They highlight as being possibly significant or possibly beneficial. But none of the fluency results appeared to me to be statistically significant, at least within an effect size guide. There are other metrics we can use to determine statistical significance, like p-values, but effect sizes, in my opinion, is the best tool for using this. And actually, What Works Clearinghouse summarizes the effect sizes for all the studies that they review. And when I actually looked through What Works Clearinghouse report, almost all of those effect sizes they had listed were also below that 0.2 threshold. Again, suggesting that there's very little likelihood that this program is providing a meaningful benefit or a measurable benefit to students. But again, they gave them that tier 1 rating. Evaluating programs is difficult. We have to look at not just one of these variables. So I'm going to be honest, personally, in the past, I think I overly looked at impact of the results of studies, but you do have to consider quality and quantity as well. But the problem with the ESSA model is that it's just so focused on this quality side of the pyramid here that it ignores the other two sides. We need to make sure that the results of studies are also showing that the program works, is beneficial, and that it's been replicated. It's not enough, in my opinion, to just pick out the highest quality studies and say, did they produce any kind of statistically significant effect? Again, because most studies will show a positive effect. It's really way too low a barrier and a bar, especially if we're only going to allow companies with the highest budgets to have their studies reviewed. Well, that's it for now, folks, and until next time.